We will be starting now on session 3, and we'll try to get back to the timing of our agenda, although luckily we have a good ample time for this discussion. So this session 3 is titled African Leadership on Copyright and the Public Interest. And we will be examining the relationship between discussions at the domestic level, regional level, and at the international level in diverse fora, but we'll focus in particular on the World Intellectual Property Organization, as here we've had for the past years more substantial movement on copyright discussions. Of course, all of you are free to engage on other relevant fora. For example, if you wish to make a reference to what might be important processes in UNESCO or other potential fora that we're not perhaps giving enough attention where copyright issues could also be discussed. I'll just briefly give a few reminder points of what has been a historical discussion on copyright issues at the international level. Just to point that we have witnessed, at least for the past 10 years, a significant increase in the voices of African participation in copyright-related discussions in the international forum. And this is really significant. The World Intellectual Property Organization has traditionally been a forum similar to the Council for Intellectual Property Issues at the World Trade Organization, the TRIPS. From the TRIPS agreement, the TRIPS Council was established. And here you've seen that generally proposals, observations, discussions, and experiences that are shared have focused largely on, let's say, the broader Western countries. And so we have had limited opportunities for really looking at what was, national context specific for developing countries. And that really began to change in WIPO over the past couple of years. And this is why this is rightly entitled African Leadership, because there's been that significant shift. Now, we can all discuss together what are different enablers of that shift and where it should go now. But I would just highlight 2 points. One, of course, has been the policymakers from the African continent being more active in these processes, and importantly, because of the reform processes taking place. And secondly, there has been significant support from the academic and the civil society community, in addition to the more traditional influence from, let's say, right holder communities. So these together have been important elements in providing this positive change in context. So that's what we'll be discussing in this session. For this, we have a great panel of speakers. We have, we might not have with us Mohamed Bakir, who is the first secretary of the Permanent Mission of Algeria in Geneva, who has been the coordinator for the African group on issues at the World Intellectual Property Organization. He unfortunately cannot make it in person, and it seems he is not at the moment able to join us online. But we do wish to acknowledge that he's played a very critical role. I think those of you in Geneva with the African group consultations would know that he has played an important role in supporting these processes in the past years. But we do have with us someone also who knows very well the context of the Geneva discussions, which is Georges-Rémi Namekong, who is Minister-Counsellor of the Permanent Delegation of the African Union in Geneva, and also always a very strong partner in assisting the African group in all multilateral processes. Then we also have others who have been deeply involved in the substantive issues, providing support to African countries. Professor Chidi Oguamanam, who's research chair in sustainability, bioinnovation, and indigenous knowledge systems and global knowledge governance of the University of Ottawa. So Professor Chidi, thank you very much for being with us. We also have Dr. John Assain, Director General of the Nigerian Copyright Commission, Mrs. Sharon Chahale Wata, Deputy Director, Training and Research of the Kenya Copyright Board, Elizabeth Nyagura, Deputy Director General of the Zimbabwe Intellectual Property Office. And then we will also be hearing some reflections back from the panel from Professor Joseph Fometeu from the University of Ngaoundéré from Cameroon, and from Jace Nair, CEO of Blind South Africa. So with that, I'd like to give the floor first to Georges from the delegation of the African Union in Geneva for his views on the general framework of discussions in Geneva. Thank you, George, very much.
Okay. Thank you, Viviana, for giving me the floor. And I should also thank the organizers of this event for the invitation extended to the members of the African group in Geneva, as well as to the representative of the African Union. You know, the African Union has an office in Geneva, and this office is mainly supporting the efforts of the African group in the international negotiations. Coming to the negotiations, our focus in this afternoon will be on WIPO issues. The African group following WIPO issues has been there for many years. When I joined the African Union in 2006, the African group was following WIPO issues, but with its main focus on development agenda. Later on, when I joined in 2006, we found that the African group was not really very active in other committees. And we started with the support of diplomats that were in Geneva at the time. We started following other issues closely. But we were facing a lot of difficulties. We were missing technical expertise to support our positions. And we were also missing concrete proposals on the table. We were coming with ideas, but no concrete proposals on the table. And then we decided to reverse the situation by beginning to become not only active, but becoming proactive by tabling proposals, by tabling positions paper, and not only limited ourselves to statements that are made when discussions are going on. And by doing so, we decided to organize retreats, workshops, to reinforce our capacities. We also decided to invite experts based on the continent or in universities around the world to come and assist us with position papers, with proposals, concrete proposals. I should remember that one of the first experts to help us was John Asen, who is sitting on the table. That I'm referring to the work within the IGC, when we were requested to come with comments. So he assisted us. Later on, Professor Fometeu, who is also present in this room, helped us with some provisions on exceptions and limitations to copyright for education and research. And so we continue with the support of other experts, including NGOs that supported us with documents that we were capable to rely on in order to defend our positions. Very recently, again, we benefited the support of Teresa Dick that provided us with some resources so that we can prepare adequately our preparation for the next sessions of the WIPO negotiations, including the one on exceptions and limitations. So the African Union task is mainly to support the coordination of the African group within the international negotiations. We support the coordinators who are mainly the speaker of the group. We change them every year, and currently is our colleague from Algeria. The next coordinator will be surely appointed next year. Next month, sorry, in February, early February. We are still working on that. What are we doing really? What we do is that during the negotiations, our coordinator, who is our speaker, will benefit from the support of the African Union, the support from experts based in the capitals, from experts from university, to develop positions paper, to promote the positions, and also we try to talk to NGOs that are in support of our positions. We also talk to member states that share the same views with us on different issues. And also sometimes we talk to developed countries. Sometimes we succeed in dividing them on certain positions, but it's not always the case. So basically that's how we coordinate our positions. During the meetings of the different committees, we meet every day to strategize, to see what we are going to work, how we are going to defend our positions. I should also say that we benefit from the support of the WIPO Secretariat. We don't have, when I say we, I mean the African Council, they don't have a lot of means, so it's the WIPO Secretariat mainly paying for the travel of African experts that will come to Geneva during the sessions to support and to assist the African group of negotiators. And but it's a real challenge for us to bring expertise to Geneva during international negotiations. If this meeting can help us by addressing this specific need, it will be welcome. We also continue to rely on a very limited number of experts. They are not too much, they are not many, and sometimes if they are not available, we may face a situation where during technical discussions, we Geneva-based diplomats, we don't have the necessary expertise needed to interact with our partners from US, from European Union. They have a lot of expertise. We do not have enough. So if this meeting also can help us in addressing this problem, that will be welcome. I will stop here and thank you again for inviting me and for giving me the floor.
Thank you, George, for opening up the discussion with this overview of where things stand in the Geneva WIPO environment. I would highlight the point that the WIPO development agenda was an important point even before discussing the specific elements at the Copyright Committee. Because the development agenda in 2004 really outlined from a developing country perspective, and it's a broad agreement. It was proposed by the African group as a whole, together with many other developing countries, including Argentina, Brazil, and many others. And that changed the overall thinking that intellectual property law reforms or processes in WIPO were only focused on the traditional aspects of increasing intellectual property protection and enforcement, but that issues of the overall public interest and ensuring an adequate balance between those that require protection through the IP system as well as the users, and both their rights should be equally discussed and dealt with within these committees in the WIPO context. So I think that's a good reminder that part of the discussions and part of the efforts that have been done on particular copyright issues and traditional knowledge, which we're also covering in this forum, related to copyright, but perhaps in a broader aspect, we might make some comments on that. That really comes from that change of perception that we can, if we want to have a strong intellectual property system, it must be balanced and respond to all the needs of users. And this has definitely been reflected in the African group positions on limitations and exceptions for copyright. So we'll be moving to continue to hear a few more views about how the copyright limitation exception agenda and related issues have been addressed or are being addressed in WIPO. And for that, I would like to invite Professor Chidi Oguamanam to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see a lot of colleagues I have seen in different fora. And let me say my big thanks to the the organizers of this forum for the opportunity to be able to participate at this space at this time. Let me be clear. My brief wasn't in relation to copyright per se. It was to talk about the intersection of what is going on at SCCR and IGC. But let me build up upon what George was saying. It is to the credit of the African group that limitations and exceptions are still within the agenda of the SCCR for the most part, particularly after the Marrakesh Treaty. So that is a lot of story entirely as to how that is. But let me leverage this opportunity as somebody who has been participating at the IGC to reflect on a few of the impressions I have heard over the period. And let me also say this. The African group has been very solid, active, consolidated, and quite frankly, seriously engaging at every level of the debate at IGC. And of course, this is consistently working together with a group of like-minded states, and sometimes with China and other actors in that space. And to the credit of that effort, as you know already, the genetic resources text is now one for which there is an anticipated diplomatic conference in 2024. And a backdrop to that was to say, for the first time in WIPO history, the General Assembly was able to give a nod to proceed to a diplomatic conference on the basis of a CHIA's text. And we were negotiating with a group of people or interests for whom, in relation to IGC, the best outcome is no outcome. So the Africa group took the bull by the horn to the point that we were consistently discouraged from pushing forward with, trying to get the CHIA's text to move forward to the diplomatic congress. And for the first time, we demonstrated that precedents are set by men and women, and precedents are also broken by men and women. So that's so important. And let me fall back a little bit from some of my observations at the intersections of SCCR and IGC. The one that speaks to me for the purpose of this very forum is limitations and exceptions. If you take a critical look at the TK text as at the 45th IGC and the TCE text as at the same IGC, you see a lot of competing drafts of limitations and exceptions. We don't have the luxury of flashing them on the screen, but what you see very simply is that the African group has been rooting for a single text of limitations and exceptions expressed in very simple and general language, such that it falls back to nation states and, as the case may be, indigenous peoples and local communities to determine the extent of limitations and exceptions. But in a sea of what I call a massive mess, you see that those who have completely opposed expansion of limitations and exceptions in SCCR since 2012 are now the ones piling up a lot of limitations and exceptions in TK texts and TCE texts. And I looked at the limitations and exceptions sponsored by United States, and folks, I'm not a diplomat, I'm an academic, so I can afford to take the liberty. Sponsored by the United States, by Japan, by Korea, and to some degree the European Union. All they have put in limitations or exceptions, if you follow thoroughly to that, then there is no reason for which we have spent up to 2000 to 2023 talking about protection of traditional knowledge. So every other thing we struggled out, they wanted to flush away through the drains of limitations and exceptions. And by the way, those are the people who told us, oh, if you wanted limitations and exceptions in SCCR, we should go and ask for technical support so that Africans and developing countries will make use of the limitations and exceptions that are already in the book. That's exactly what they've been telling us. But when it comes to TK and TCEs, they become the fanatics, not even the fans of limitations and exceptions. So that kind of is quite troubling from the negotiating point of view. And let me stop by saying something else. As Africans, defending TK TCEs, which is one of our areas of a comparative advantage in creativity and innovation. And we are boxed in a situation where, you want exceptions and limitations liberally, but when it comes to your own, quote and unquote, you don't want it. You are lukewarm about it. You don't see the merit of it. My response to this is that TK and TCEs and the custodians are not like the custodians and defenders of copyright establishment. And we cannot compare apples and oranges. And the reason we are at IGC is because the fundamental intellectual property framework, i.e. the TRIPS agreement, was silent on TK. And they told us we had better speak about TK in another forum. And that is to confirm that the TK and TCEs, they do not perfectly fit within the framework of intellectual property. And therefore, if we're negotiating at IGC, we should have that on our mind, that we're looking for sui generis, something never done before, that will accommodate the sensitivities and the peculiar nature of TK's TCEs. I will bench at this point and probably will speak more through the question and answers. Thank you very much.
Professor Chidi, thank you very much for those comments. Just following from what you were saying on traditional knowledge, there's also the text on genetic resources at WIPO that's being discussed, where you see also this parallel with the limitations and exceptions provision that's being proposed, a very extensive one for the article that developing countries are seeking to introduce, which is to introduce a mandatory requirement on patent applications to have the patent applicant, when they're using genetic resources and including traditional knowledge associated to a genetic resource, to name what was the origin. It could be country, but it could also be, for example, a collection anywhere in the world where it's been taken from, and to establish, where was this taken from, and that would help in transparency efforts through the intellectual property system in order to seek to follow through the access and benefit sharing regime that we have established under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So ironically here as well, you see that it is now the developed countries that are proposing a long list of limitations and exceptions as well to the disclosure requirement. Secondly, I think I would highlight just that you mentioned how IP law traditionally did not take into account perhaps other forms of innovation, including those that spur the collective context from traditional knowledge and others, and that this is part of the efforts to see how this can be addressed within WIPO, and we see a large imbalance in that approach. Professor Chidi, just before moving to our next presenter, I'll just note that there was a question from a previous session from one of the online participants who had a particular question on indigenous knowledge in terms of copyright or patents, and the particular question that was coming from Fikile Vilakasi from the Gender Equity Unit at the University, sorry, I'm not sure. Okay, University of Western Cape. Just to make sure that we're also listening to those online and having you engage. So to Professor Chidi, I wanted to direct this in the sense that the question is, if there is an exploration so this is the case that's presented, a medicinal plant, whereby there is someone who will be doing the collection in a forest of the herb, then it might be used by a second or third party, but then there is someone else who decides to write about the property uses of such plant. Where would the copyright, who would retain the copyright? Is it who has written about this plant, and what would be the rights to the person who actually first collected and knew about the use, but maybe not having that knowledge in written form?
Thank you very much. That question is really, if I were teaching in a classroom, that is really a practical question to ask in terms of all the stuff we talk about and the practice of it. And it reminds me of the debate we have had at IGC, where we were talking about the origins and sources of traditional knowledge. And in one of the drafting exercises we did, we injected the whole idea of dream and revelation, which is very strange in the Western mind as how you acquire knowledge. And that's what makes traditional knowledge unique. And so even Aboriginal indigenous peoples of Australia and Canada and New Zealand and elsewhere in the world, they know about revelations through dreams. You can acquire it, you can transfer it through dreams. Your great-grandmother might appear to you in a dream and talk to you about a herb you can use in order to cure a particular ailment that is ravaging the community. And this is reasonably documented all over. So when you get that kind of dream and revelation, the question is this: what kind of intellectual property could you lay claim to? And it can be an oral transmission of knowledge at that point. It can be within the metaphysical realm, who knows? But then somebody takes that dream and runs with it. And then we begin to run into the realm of copyright, because copyright protects expression of ideas. And then you put it down and write it down. Somebody takes it, goes to the laboratory and takes the particular herb, put it on a test tube, and begin to write an invention out of it. And it walks through the realm of patents. And you can walk it through trademarks, if you like, and up to geographical indications, as the case may be. So this is really what tells you about the nature of traditional knowledge, where it hits to some degree every aspect of intellectual property right, yet it is not completely protected by intellectual property. So through these chains of transmission of knowledge, there is no denying the fact that the fundamental knowledge comes from an undocumented source that is not readily recognized. So what I'm trying to answer in terms of this question is to say, depending on what stage you are in the chain of transmission of knowledge, a particular intellectual property is engaged. But if you were to ask me, the most significant contribution is the one that is least recognized and protected in that chain. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. And if we do have more time afterwards in the panel, we might then come back to this issue. But I think I see a hand raised on this issue. Follow-up, please go ahead, so we don't lose the flow.
Are we already taking questions?
If it's related to this question, why not? So we can,
if
you can please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yes, I am Malebageng Forer. So thanks, Prof. Chidi. You know, the question of traditional knowledge and intellectual property always is a difficult one. And I think for many of us Africans, we always say or claim that Western countries have imposed their laws onto us and their systems of protection onto us. So traditional knowledge is foreign to them, but it is not to us. So my question always is, why do we want to use the mainstream or conventional intellectual property discipline to protect traditional knowledge? Why don't we show leadership in coming up with a sui generis system that will take into account things, things such as dreams, which is an origin of where knowledge comes from? Because when you look at all aspects of IP, they fail to protect traditional knowledge. You look at the South African law, for instance, trying to protect traditional knowledge, it's an utter failure as far as I'm concerned. So I think we need to show leadership that this is how we would want to protect our traditional knowledge and not use the traditional IP system. And I think until such time that I can see African leaders and scholars, setting the stage and devising new systems of protecting traditional knowledge, I think we are going to lose a lot. This is why the Western countries will even introduce foreign concepts to traditional knowledge, such as exceptions. Thank you.
That was a very important intervention, I must say. And let me tell you, it is most people who are looking for an outcome from IGC, at some point in my work, I just reconcile with the idea that IGC has made significant contributions, even if we don't end up with any treaty arising from it, because it has contributed significantly to the jurisprudence. Let me give you an example. The moment, along with the African group and the Indigenous caucus, we talked about revelation and dreams as a channel for transmission of knowledge. It was a teaching moment for us, particularly from our Western friends who, for them, this was Valbadash. And so, and we've ended up writing it into that text. Whether it survives it eventually is not within our power, but we stay put. So by the time you move it to that level, incrementally, it begins to develop. And one other thing about IGC, we call it a framework treaty. We cannot sit in Geneva and start telling indigenous peoples in remote areas of the world how to govern their knowledge when we don't have any idea about their legal traditions and practices and so on. So that's why we try at the level of making it a framework document. But our friends would rather inject exceptions and limitations that will cover about 2 pages of a document that's supposed to be probably 5 pages at most. So this is the dynamic. So there's a lot of progress being made, but incrementally. And of course, the international nature of this, before, when I was not deeply involved in these negotiations, as an academic, you can sit right in your office, take out a treaty and tear it apart and publish a paper to critique it. But when you really put your hand in the mess, you really understand that it's give and take kind of thing, and gradually you lose some, you win some. But at least there is a lot of progress being made. But the point you made is clear. We need to take national or local leadership of some of these concepts. Instead of building from above, we should be building from bottom. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chidi. I'll take one more comment or question on this issue, and then we'll be...
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, thank you so much. My name is Unati Ndigi. I also work for Recreate, but also I'm a traditional healer myself. So I'm practicing what we are discussing here. I dream the herbs. I go and fetch the herbs at the forest, and I would use them. And sometimes I work with other pharmacists to develop medicine. So I think it's going to be important, as Professor just said now, that we really push as African leaders in the academia and in the legal fraternity to push for a true African system that is going to fit us as Africans and our ways. The concepts, for instance, in the legal concepts that are there, the explanations of the concept have got absolutely nothing to do with our experiences and how we explain ourselves. So there is a lot that needs to happen. We can no longer be the people that depend on other people's concepts about our own concepts. So we really need to do something about that. And it's something that we as Traditional Healers Association, we will greatly support. The problem right now when it comes to intellectual property, we don't see ourselves in those concepts that are there legally and in academia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that rich discussion. And I think this broadly comes to show that tension between the fact that existing intellectual property legislations cannot be done away with. So part of the effort is also to see what can be done within the scope of those existing laws and deal with the problems it's created. And on the other side, also how to create carve-outs or special spaces now to introduce issues of particular importance for our communities and our countries, which are not covered at all by the intellectual property system. And to define what is that scope where we do need multilateral agreement, and what are the things where we can do just by national law or regional law that we don't require this to go to the multilateral level. So, of course, traditional knowledge and regulation of genetic resource has all of these aspects. In the copyright field, I think there's also these questions that emerge. But, for example, when we come back to the position of the African group on different copyright issues at the multilateral level, you see also the effort being made in parallel as reforms that we'll discuss and processes domestically and regionally are taking place, to use the multilateral fora also as a place for bringing in this force or this support for those reform processes to take bear then and inform also the national debate. So we see, both from bottom down up to the multilateral level informing the process, and also what's happening at the multilateral level. For example, when the discussions on limitations and exceptions and the importance for education and of course for the visually impaired persons that we'll also hear about, and we all know the importance of the Marrakesh Treaty, that in itself, though it was a multilateral process, it really helped also to bring down, and we're still in that process of trying to ensure that adequate reforms are done to allow those. And where we have, more transnational activities, then of course, the more we have other countries also assisting in the kind of regulations we need, the more they might support our communities as well. In particular, for example, now with extraction of, traditional knowledge or genetic resources in our territories. So with that, we'll be moving on just for the moment on the topic so that we can hear from the very high-level participants we have here, a country from different country experiences, and where we can also hear about what are the domestic processes that are happening, in particular with respect to copyright. What are some of the new ideas coming from? Where do you see the pressures as well for change, or some of the tensions between stakeholders? So you are generally free to focus on which topics you might find of more interest to address with regards to what is happening in the domestic context. I'd like to first invite Dr. John Asnin from the Nigerian Copyright Commission for his intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Moderator. I was actually going to choose to speak on traditional knowledge, but no, it's okay. I'll come back to my topic. It was getting so interesting talking about traditional knowledge. I must thank the organizers of this conference. I didn't know it was going to be such a wonderful and very enriching experience. Frankly, I've learned so much, and I've had some of our ideas further crystallized, and that will help us in going forward. So I thank the organizers, and I thank everyone that's contributed to bring us down here, and you've been so hospitable. Now, I was actually going to ask, what is leadership? Because this is all in the context of Africa taking leadership. But I see that, like George did mention, Africa and the African group has managed to come out of all the initial difficulties, and has been able to take some leadership, and some of the positions that Africa and the African group are taking have since matured, and that gives us hope that some other areas will eventually, despite the pushbacks and all the wide exceptions that have been thrown in to water down the provisions, I think we'll get somewhere. When I remember what happened with the Marrakesh Treaty, at the point we thought it would never happen, and some experts were like, how can you have a treaty for exceptions? It's never done before. And I was like, look, yeah, then do it. And I think that's probably what we come to realize now, that some things may never have been done before. This might just be the time for us to do it. And I think that's where I would go with the African group, that we need to keep pushing for some of the things we believe will be in our interest. But having said that, it's easy to do all the talk in Geneva. And I think there's something that, if we must have leadership, I always say that much as you're going to be thinking globally, you must come back home and act at the local level. And this is very important. For instance, the sentiment just expressed about the need for us to begin to design and devise our own frameworks at the national levels to address some of these issues will be very instructive. For instance, I'm at pains, understanding why expressions of folklore is taking the front burner at the international level, but when it comes to African countries, frankly, no country has been able to, use the provisions they have in their laws in a way that you can demonstrate and show that this is something or this is how it should be done. So I think we need to do more work at the national level. But having said that, I will just, run through some of the way our minds worked when at the national level we were going through our reform of the copyright legislation. And hopefully I'll be able to touch on some of the speed bumps that, slowed us down and we've not been able to get to where we are. Fortunately, it's not been as turbulent as it was here in South Africa. And I'm also hoping that in the case of South Africa, things are settling now and you also get over these bumpy rides, to get the law reformed. Now, the overarching goal in approaching the reform in Nigeria was to see how we could leverage on copyright in a balanced but responsible manner as a tool for the sustainable use of the knowledge ecosystem. Whether we talk about balance or talk about setting boundaries, I think we are all agreed on this. It's when it comes to the nitty-gritty that we have disagreements as to how that should be done. For instance, when we're here discussing whether there should be a right to research or the kind of exceptions that should be provided, you wonder why it should be so difficult to understand the need to use the copyright system to advance knowledge, to advance learning. But then I understand how it works. We are in a society where in an era where what is good for the goose may never be good for the gander. So you don't even try to use that, idiomatic expression these days, because people are very selective, and we often have selective amnesia and forget what we once propagated or what once, put forward as positions. For instance, we know that very often when you want to push for some exception, the first thing they throw at you is the Berne Convention. And when you go back to the Berne Convention and you read all the discussions at the point of negotiations, you wonder why we are trying to now flip the coin against developing countries. And I also know that when the first Copyright Act was formulated, it was essentially first and foremost to encourage learning. And we seem to have forgotten that so easily. And it's more like now the copyright system is now to encourage entrepreneur, which is okay. I have no issues with that so long as we find a way of striking the balance. So for Nigeria, we had 4 major objectives which we try to push. And these objectives have now been put in the copyright bill. So we have the first objective, which I'm sure will always be, will sound like good music to those who push for more rights, and that's to provide appropriate, to provide more rights and for authors as a reward in recognition of their intellectual efforts. Now that sounds like good music, but the second one is to provide appropriate limitations and exceptions to guarantee access to creative works. And once you put that second spin, then it does appear that we have issues with people who think that may not be one of the objectives, but you can't but have that as an objective. And of course, we try to see how we'll comply with international obligations. And finally, we also try to build capacity at the national level to enable the appropriate authority to be able to better regulate, administer, enforce the provisions of the law for the good of the country and the knowledge, the content providers in Nigeria. Now, I will quickly, because I know we'll come back to when the questions come. I believe that the need to address public interest has always been recognized, whether we want to say it or we want to be silent on that. At least at some notional level, we've all always agreed that there's need to address public interest, and this has been all through history. Because even at the negotiations of the Berne Convention, there was a provision in the text allowing member states to limit the rights of authors in certain circumstances. And what we have done in Nigeria is to try and see how we can bring those exceptions out in a way that users of the law will easily and immediately see that these are exceptions. For instance, we've moved the exceptions from being just a schedule to becoming part of the substantive provisions in the law. That, to me, will help the users to be able to immediately cite the exceptions. Now, Nigeria has a bill, like many of us know. The bill passed through Parliament last year, and we are hoping that the signing of that bill will come soon. But I know that when a bill signing is delayed, you look under to see where the pushbacks are coming from. Like they say in Nigeria and maybe in some of the African sayings, when you see the calabash dancing on the river, you know that the drummer is down, in the river or somewhere at the riverbed. So what it means that when you see the calabash dancing, it's not dancing on its own. The waves are probably the ones causing the calabash to rock. So when the bill is not coming out as you want it, it might just be that these interests have been able to reach, some conspiratorial level where they can, slow down things. But beyond the conspiracies, I know that there are also the speed bumps that we have to deal with. And I will just mention quickly some of the speed bumps that I think Nigeria experienced. One, sometimes, is the lack of sustained political will. It's not enough to say you want the bill. You must be there at every point to be able to help the system to come to a logical conclusion. The second is the lack of resources. Sometimes you need to put resources to be able to call for the kind of meetings that are required to get all stakeholders together. Even having a public hearing could be a challenge in some countries. And speaking for Nigeria, that will always be a speed bump. Then, of course, the other speed bump is the precedents you have, floating around. And if you're not careful, you could end up picking the wrong precedent from the wrong law. I've said that until recently, we've had this problem in Africa where one country sees another law and just goes to pick a provision from the other country, not knowing how they got there. For instance, I know a country that picked some provisions from the Nigerian law, and I was like, why? If only you knew what we're suffering with this provision, you wouldn't take it. And I mean, you didn't even ask us how it's working, and you just put it in your own law, and I said, well, I wish you best of luck. Very often, wishing luck is never enough. So I think it's always good to be able to look at those precedents and know which ones are good for you. Then, of course, there's the weak national expertise. And that's why it's good. I'm happy to see a lot of academics and civil society groups, getting interested. Although I always say that you have to be careful to know how to swallow what even the civil society groups give to you. You have to process it. But it helps because then they're able to come with some less, more altruistic, persuasions, and they're able to give you the options that you can choose from. So we have more academics coming now, and that has helped to build the national expertise. Now, the fifth bump is competing national priorities. Frankly speaking, sometimes copyright is not on the front burner. For instance, Nigeria is going to general elections in February. I mean, this is not the best time to talk about, copyright issues, because that's not a matter of life and death as far as politicians are concerned. So that could slow down things. Of course, the absence of informed industry participation, that's often a challenge, because very often you have right owners in the country who should be speaking for, for themselves, but they don't just seem to know what to say. And they have to now rely on other groups from outside to help them and steer them, very often not necessarily in the best national interest. So we have that as a speed bump. The other speed bump I have recognized is the unbalanced representations in the dialogues and in the conversations. Because, for instance, until recently, you will never find a group dealing or pushing for the users. You will not find a group pushing for society as a whole. So you end up having the content providers, the entrepreneurs being the ones always driving all the discussions. For instance, I told Teresa this, that even in Nigeria, we had very little input from the library, groups, and you would have thought that would be the most enlightened group that will be able to speak to what should be. So that puts the agency in a difficult position trying to find the balance, because then you must take leadership and you will be responsible for what comes out in the final bill. The other bump is the undue, and I put that in, whether it's undue or whether it's okay, I don't know, but the international interference can be overwhelming, and they could disrupt, they could capsize your ship, they could, turn things the wrong way, they could disrupt your process, and sometimes you just don't know how to manage them. But I guess this is the new normal. You can't go through your bill without having, all these guys come, and it's now left for you to ensure that you keep the rudder in a way and steer your ship in a way that it doesn't get capsized, because they will always come. The other speed bump is just the bureaucracy and the slow legislative process. And in some countries like Nigeria, if you miss a particular session in parliament, you may have to start all over. So it's like going back, the snake and ladder thing. Once you get to the snake, then you go back to where you started from. And that has been a problem in many countries. And I think the final one is the rapid changes that we find in this field. It's like a kaleidoscope, and it's almost like copyright issues become moving targets. Just when you thought you had provided for it, the technology has changed, and you have to keep, reordering. For instance, I got to hear about the issues about data mining. I was like, hey, I won't go back to redraft the bill because of data mining. We'll work with what we have. If we can get through it, fine. If we cannot, you wait for the next round of revision, then we put in data mining. That is important because you can never get to accommodate every concern and every issue in every particular process. So as the targets are moving, it might be a good time for you to just move on and wait for the next time it comes again for you to be able to shoot down. I will stop there while the targets are still moving. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. Excellent way to kick off on domestic processes and reforms. And now I'll hand to our colleague from Kenya, Ms. Sharon Chahale, who will tell us about the Kenyan experience. And just to note, if you can hold all your questions after we finish all the domestic experiences, then you can take your questions together or address them to a specific person.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, Madam Chair. We are really happy to be here and be part of this conversation. Yeah, so I will speak to the overview of the legislative amendment process in Kenya. And someone had asked me a question about the amendments that we have done, why we have done so many amendments recently, little by little, instead of, sort of just overhauling the whole thing. Well, maybe I'll give us a bit of a background. So initially, of course, like all of us, we had a really old law that wasn't serving the purpose. And then we did a copyright amendment in 2001. So we now have the Copyright Act of 2001, which we have been using. But recently, we have had several amendments, one being in 2019, that addressed different issues. One of the issues we needed to address at that point that was very crucial was the issue of regulation of CMOs, because it constantly brought issues for us. And every time we would purport to do anything, they would run to court and question our mandate, where we're getting it from. Because initially the Act says that we regulate and that is it. So you define what regulation is. So if I ask you for your maybe finances and say, how much did you collect, how much did you distribute, they run to court and say, what mandate do you have to ask for that? So we needed to put something a bit clearer in terms of the regulation. So like with that one, it was addressing a lot of that, yeah? But it brought in a bit of new things, like with the internet service providers and things like that. Then after that, we had another amendment in 2020 that addressed something different. So basically, we have just been addressing the needs as they arise. And then last year, we also had another amendment, 2022. And then we have had 2 amendments done in an omnibus, and a miscellaneous amendment. One of them was to address our large board. We had a board of 17 members. So we needed to put it down to around 9, because initially I think they had wanted to include everybody. So it was like, have a musician, have a filmmaker, have a publisher, have everybody, and then you end up with a board that's 17 members. So we needed to deal with that. But then, of course, it's easier and faster to do that in a miscellaneous amendment, omnibus kind of thing. So that's why we've done that. So in the last few years, since 2019, we seemingly, and I think this question had come from Victor, we seemingly have had so many amendments, and you know, guys had been asking us, so why not just sit down and overhaul the whole thing, yeah? But I think for us, the amendments really and the process has been about responding to issues as they were arising. But secondly, also, that the process is not solely in our hands as the copyright board, because of course it originates with a bill, and how it works for us is that the bill could originate in several ways. One, from a parliamentary party. It could come from the executive. The bill could come from individual members of parliament. It could also come from a member of the public petitioning parliament, or pushing it through a member of parliament that you know. So all these ways could originate a bill. And in fact, because of this, last year, I think last year, yeah, there's a time we saw in the media about a copyright amendment bill, and they were, of course, the member of parliament who was pushing it, they were calling it her bill, yeah? And it's her bill on copyright. And we were like, okay, we didn't know about this. And when we looked through the proposed bill, she was purporting to delete a section we had inserted in 2019 on the issue of ISPs. We had introduced something we are calling a takedown notice, so that if your work is being infringed online, then you can give out a takedown notice to the ISP to pull it down. And so she was purporting to delete that without consulting us, without talking to us. And you know, we are up in arms, and so we had to lobby also through parliament to have that not to happen. So you see, if it entirely depended on us in terms of pushing bills, then we would have the control, but it doesn't entirely depend on us, and sometimes it gets politically hijacked. In the recent past, my assessment is that we have had more political participation in the area of copyright, because in the last regime, we had a president who, the first time he came in with his deputy, they came in on a platform of like youth, and they were sort of appealing to the youth, the young people. Melissa is laughing. I don't know why. They were sort of appealing to the young demography in the country, and oh yeah, we are young people and we are all this. And that president, the artists, the musicians had access to the previous president, because even some of them were in his campaign team, and some of them ended getting jobs. So artists had access, and they could go and give their grievances. But being that, of course, the president is not a copyright expert, if you give him your grievances, he will take them as they are and not really, you know, look at it from the expert view. And so we found that politically, we had a lot of interest in terms of even amending our act. There was so many political interests involved in that. So that has necessitated all these amendments for us. The other thing is that we could have sat down and just, sort of overhaul the whole thing and put everything that you want to do. But also there has been an idea in Kenya to merge the Copyright Office, which is a standalone at the moment, with the Industrial Property Office and the Anti-Counterfeit Agency. So again, of course, all these processes, you can't divorce them from the political process, but it has been such a long process. So that meant that you are curtailed from doing a lot of things by yourself, because potentially you're earmarked for merging, and so a lot of things really just have to take a back seat. Now we have a change of regime since last year, of course, and so we have to wait again and see the new regime, what are their priorities, what do they have in mind with regards to the creative sector and all that. And I think the last thing I would say is, of course, it has been the issue of responding to the need. Somebody said here earlier in the earlier panel that we have been issuing advisories, for example, to respond to things. One of the issues, for example, during the pandemic that drew a debate in Kenya was on the issues of DJs and the use of music, and so we had to respond to that. Then there came an issue with cover songs, and we had to respond and issue an advisory. So we have had to respond to things as they arise, even in our new normal during the pandemic and all that. So there was an increase at certain point, and even leading up into the pandemic season with infringement online. And so with response to that, we had to do certain amendments to be able to respond to that need. I think I'll stop there. Then maybe if there are questions or any other more discussions, I can add after that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Now we'll move to Elizabeth Nyagura from the Zimbabwe Intellectual Property Office. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting Zimbabwe to be part of this conference, and we really feel honored. I'll start with maybe where our current legislation on copyright, where it's like Zimbabwe is copyright is currently regulated by the Copyright Act, Chapter 2605, which was which came into effect in 2004, and this act actually has got a very clear limitations and exceptions for access to copyright material for researchers as well as other works in terms of Section 24 up to 2040. But however, there is a gap in this current legislation in that it does not have a provision on the use or access to copyright material for the visually impaired as well as the print disabled. As well, the other gaps that are there in the current legislation are provisions in the digital environment, and also it did not have other provisions on resale, as well as protection of or technological protection measures. So having considered these gaps, in order again to come up with a balance between both the users, the right users, as well as the right holders, the government decided to review the legislation in 2019 so that it's like we'll be able to make sure that all the interests of our copyright users and copyright holders are actually addressed. And this journey has taken us up to now. We don't have an act yet. It's still a layman's draft, because when we started this process, we did not carry out the necessary legal processes. We started by coming up with a layman's draft without having the principles. And I'm happy to say that as of now, we now have the principles for the bill. So going forward, it's like the process is now followed the due process, and we are hopefully that this will also ensure that we have an act before the end of this year. But like what my colleague from Nigeria has said, again, we also have an election coming before the end of the year. So I'm trying to expedite the process so that before the end of the year, we'll be having a new legislation on copyright. And the proposed changes that are in the draft, among others, the first one being provisions on exceptions and limitations on the for the visually impaired as well as the print disabled, because our country actually acceded to the Marrakesh Treaty in 2018 as well as the Beijing Treaty. So already we are members of those treaties. And again, another provision that is coming up in the new draft bill are functions of the office which were not or are not in the current legislation. These functions are explicitly stated in the proposed bill, one of them being the office will now be mandated to carry out advocacy and awareness. You find that although we have got really very good exceptions and limitations for fair dealings for researchers and etc., you find that some are ignorant of these exceptions and limitations. And why are they ignorant? Because we have not carried out advocacy and awareness. And also some of the right holders, again, do not know the provisions that protect their rights in the current act. So that is why we now have an explicit function in the proposed act to carry out advocacy and awareness for the benefit of both the right users as well as the right holders. And as well as another, again, provision that is in the proposed bill is the role of the office or the role of the registrar as an amicus curiae. And this will assist not only the right holder, but also the infringing party, because the registrar will now be able to assist or give advice in the court on matters of copyright. So in that case, that means whatever judgment will be made by the judge would have been informed or assisted by the registrar for the benefit of both the right holder and the right user. And the implementation, again, is now something that is a challenge. You find that although we have got, in the current legislation, we've got clear exceptions and limitations, you find that when it comes to implementation or even in the implementation of these reforms, there is a challenge. The challenge is arising in that we don't have a proper structure for the Copyright Office. Hence, as a country or as an office, we are now going to have a separate intellectual property office. And I'm pleased to say that the principles have already been approved. And sometime this month, we are actually going to be, next month I want to say, we are actually going to be having a workshop to discuss the zero draft of the new bill to create a separate intellectual property office. When we now have a standalone intellectual property office, that means the mandate of that office will not be able to carry out the protection and also the use of copyrighted material in an effective and an efficient manner. So that means copyright, the implementation or the mandate of the Copyright Office will now be very efficient. And also that means we are now having two bills that are now being supervised by the office, that is the Copyright Amendment Bill as well as the bill to create a separate intellectual property office. And whilst on awareness, the other challenge that we face is on lack of awareness on our legislature. These are the people, the parliamentarians, who actually pass the bills. So if when they don't have that knowledge on copyright, that means it will also delay the promulgation of the law. So there is need to actually make sure that the legislature, the MPs, are also educated on the benefits of copyright, not only to the right holders, but also to the users of the copyrighted works. So this is another challenge that we also meet as an office and that we need to address. Safe to say that whilst I'm on awareness, as an office last year, we carried out awareness programs to 4 universities as well as 2 tertiary institutions to sensitize them on not only industrial property, but also on copyright, and both to the right holders as well as to the users. So as an office, we are now trying to balance, it's like the interest of both the users as well as the right holders. What else? And another, maybe I'd left out on the proposed amendments in the new bill. We also have a provision under the internet service providers where we have introduced again technological protection measures, where we've got exceptions that are prescribed by the minister, and this again is for the benefit of the users of the copyrighted material. In a nutshell, I can say these are some of the reforms that we are carrying out as a country in Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers. Very insightful, especially looking inside and to pinpointing to both process issues, results, and then going further in implementation as well. So I think that that will give a lot of food for particular questions, perhaps, as we look at content of copyright legislations. For our first discussion, I'd like to invite Professor Joseph Fometeu to make some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi to everyone. Thank you. I'm coming from Cameroon, and I first of all want to thank the organizers of this meeting for the invitation. I was supposed to speak in French, but for the reasons that you can imagine, I'm obliged to express myself in English. And I will apologize because I will miss some words, and maybe, I don't know, you may have some difficulties to understand what I will say, but I will try. Thank you very much once more. The title of the subsession we are currently following is "How are African countries reforming domestic copyright laws to serve public interest?" I will ask you to do something with me, just to remove the first word, how. And we keep the rest of the sentence, the rest of the question. Are African countries reforming domestic copyright laws to serve public interest? What I'm asking us to do, the exercise, is from what we have been saying since the morning about the balance that normally should be found inside our laws. Because I have a certain experience having worked with several African countries to build their national copyright laws, and I can tell you that there is no reform that is conducted specially to take into account the public interest. Generally, the reforms of laws are to take into account interest of stakeholders, interest of creators. And while they are taking into account their interest, they just wonder, what about exceptions and limitations? Are we going to keep the same exceptions and limitations, or are we going to create new exceptions and limitations? That is the question. And that brings us to the theme of the conference we are following here, a right to research in Africa. The second exercise I would like to invite us to do is, just after we have followed what have been said since this morning, and the first question that may arise is the scope of such a right, the nature of such a right, because it has been emphasized on the fact that an exception and a limitation is not a right. If we promote the creation of a right, we will have a right facing another right, that is copyright, and maybe that is the better thing to do, but what means? Which means do we have to mobilize to reach that result? First of all, from my own point of view, we have to address all the persons involved in the system. That is, the authors and, as John said, entrepreneurs. We have to keep in mind that one part, maybe the biggest part of the problem we have for the research to access to knowledge, comes from investors, come from entrepreneurs. Because if you take the price for books, for example, you have very, very expensive books. If you ask the question to the copyright owner, he will tell you that he didn't agree for the price that is practiced on the market. For example, I wrote a book and I quite fight with the editor about the price. I said, if you sell it at this price, no one will buy the book. But his interest is not yours. His interests are not ours. So when addressing this topic, please let us have in mind that we have a trader who wants to own money. And you have a copyright owner who needs recognition, who needs some money to buy vitamins and write another book and so on. Next, and I will finish there, levels of actions. Please let us equally have in mind that we have several levels on which we should act. First level, political one. From my own point of view, we have national, regional, and international level where we can act. As several classmates, permit me to call us like this, as several classmates said, some questions can be solved inside countries if these questions are correctly addressed. So I think it may be realistic to start from there, because we should have in mind that the Berne Convention empowers countries to create exceptions and limitations. So we should try to act, first of all, at the national level. Then at the regional levels, we have OAPI, we have ARIPO, levels where we can act and obtain some results. And then the international level. And the last level is a technical one. That means inside the copyright system. Getting inside the copyright system, we have to act, let me say, at three levels. First one, before the recognition of right. Second one, with right recognized, and third one, after the recognition of right. Before the recognition of right, what I'm observing is that today, everything can be copyrighted. Today, even nothing can be copyrighted. Don't forget, I'm talking about, if you heard about one contemporary work of art that has been sold 15 million euros from the Italian Salvatore Garau. So on the technical level, we should try to make sure that the conditions governing the recognition of copyright, normally these conditions should be precisely, precisely redacted inside the copyright law. Then, recognition of rights. At this level, which right should be recognized? Which one should not be recognized? I saw the matter concerning the TDMs. That is a very, very crucial problem. And that is a matter that should be addressed very, very realistically. Because, as you know, TDMs are blind. Either you benefit from an exception or a limitation. When there is a TDM, you cannot benefit from that. And then after the recognition of right, should we recognize a right to research facing the copyright? I don't know. But that is why we are here. Thank you very much. And I apologize, I have been a little bit long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and certainly we did not have any issues with your English in understanding you. I'd like to give the floor now to Jace Nair, who's been a leading regional figure for the Marrakesh Treaty with extensive experience in this trend towards ensuring public interest is considered both in national and in international copyright legislation. So Jace, if you can give us your impressions of this discussion and any other points for discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I think as the discussion commenced this morning, our perspective came from the user's perspective. And through the World Blind Union, they saw the need to create access to knowledge and for information for blind and visually impaired persons as a result of the book famine. And in order to look at how do we take that kind of process forward, we needed government intervention or state parties intervention. And the World Blind Union was fortunate in that there were a number of very empathetic diplomats at WIPO, particularly the South American group of Brazil, Ecuador, Mexico, and Paraguay, who took up the issues on behalf of blind people from their countries and developed what was called the Treaty for the Visually Impaired. Africa felt very strongly in support of the TVI. However, African delegates or African diplomats saw the need to expand that to include education, research, and archives. Of course, the United States and Europe felt that there was no need for such a treaty because as states, as rights holders, they proposed a voluntary agreement. We as users felt that for centuries we trusted those states, we trusted rights holders, but they didn't give us access. What is it now that will change? And as NGOs from Africa, or civil society from Africa, we were placed in a dilemma. We needed to support the Africa group that wanted the TVI Plus, while the World Blind Union and the BEMP countries wanted the TVI. It was a lot of negotiations and a lot of leadership from the African group that in the 11th hour at Marrakesh threw the lot in to say, let's have the TVI now and we'll talk about the plus later. And that is how Marrakesh came into being. Because Africa gave leadership. In doing so, we then had the next stage, particularly for us here in Africa. How do we make this now a reality? 2013 was a great initiative. It was the first user treaty that came into force, and within the prescribed periods, the advocacy around the world brought the treaty into force. Through the African Union, particularly through the African Charter on Children's and Human Rights and ARIPO, the civil society movement in Africa through the African Union of the Blind and other national NGOs, the advocacy resulted in a number of African countries ratifying Marrakesh. However, in ratifying Marrakesh, and I think we've seen, or we heard earlier today from Prof. Flynn, that copyright reform in Africa was far behind. Even though close on 20 African countries have ratified, we do not have national copyright regime in most of these countries. So the benefits of Marrakesh is still not being realized. Here in South Africa, it was a different kettle of fish. For over 20 years, we've been advocating for copyright reform. We've been through the Copyright Reform Commission. We participated in advocacy activities. We presented to the National Assembly, and eventually we had the Copyright Amendment Bill. And you heard this morning from Christo that the President sat on it for 13 months until, as BlindSA, we litigated and forced him to take a decision. We then had the second hurdle that the Copyright Amendment Bill was then referred to the National Assembly, and the debate was, will the Assembly just focus on the item that the President highlighted, and Section 19D was not contested, or will the whole bill come up for review? The process then forced BlindSA to go to the High Court. And in September 2021, the High Court awarded that the 1978 Copyright Act was unconstitutional. It was then for the Constitutional Court to now confirm this order. This happened in September 2022. In the interim, the National Assembly further revised the Copyright Amendment Bill, which now has gone to the National Council of Provinces. Section 27 and BlindSA is submitting, making a submission to the NCOP based on the Bill of Rights and the violation of our rights as blind and partially sighted people. It is clear from our interactions that our government was bullied into delaying and not signing the CAB. We are aware of the sanctions proposed by the US trade, as well as the pressures put by the EU on South Africa not to sign the Copyright Amendment Bill. With the Constitutional Court judgment of September 2022 and the reading in of Section 13A, we believe that South Africa now has the enabling environment to ratify the Marrakesh Treaty. The legislators in the provinces now are expected to go through the amended copyright bill. And again, as civil society and other activists, we believe that we need to strengthen our role in the provinces so that the Copyright Amendment Bill, not only because of the access to information and knowledge, but because of the other provisions in terms of fair royalties that affect blind composers and authors and musicians, that the CAB is as important to us as BlindSA. I think my appeal to the policymakers in Africa is to once again rise and show the leadership you gave between 2009 and 2013 in getting the TVI as the Marrakesh Treaty, to now ensure the realization of the ratification of the treaty in all the countries in Africa, and to ensure that your copyright regime allows for Marrakesh to be enjoyed by all blind and partially sighted people in the continent, to bring an end to the book famine, to bring an end to poverty, and to increase our economic well-being by allowing us access to information and knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jace. So now we have some time left to hear from anyone who wishes to bring some additional points on this intersection between copyright and the public interest, particular areas you'd like to highlight from what you heard or national experiences, or if you'd like to bring in a new element, please feel free to introduce yourself. I'll start with.
Okay, thank you for interesting presentations, especially at country level. I'm going to start my questions with the Deputy Director at Kenya Copyright Board. I was quite interested with the usage of advisory opinions in Kenya. So I've got two questions there, which I think maybe is something we can copy in South Africa, if, you know. So the first question is, what is the legal standing of the legal opinions that you issue out? Can the courts set aside the legal opinion on the basis that it is not compliant with the parent act? So that's one question I have. And for Zimbabwe, the one question I would like to have, to pose to you is, to what extent are the current exceptions being used in Zimbabwe? Because I think in your presentation, you indicated that people are not even aware of the exceptions. So if people are not aware of the exceptions and probably not being used, why do you feel compelled to expand on already what you have, which is not in use? Is it the wave that you have to comply with international treaties, or is it the demand at the national level, on the ground? And with regard to TDM's exceptions, I'm interested in seeing the provision itself, because in South Africa, we have a problem with the exceptions in relation to technological protection measures. So, and for Nigeria, those bottlenecks, Doctor, are saying, how are you bypassing them? Because I think you have the similar bottlenecks that we have in South Africa, unbalanced interests, lack of sustained political will, I think, to some extent in South Africa, as well as undue international influence. So I would be interested in hearing your answers there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take a couple more and see if there's round of questions, and then we can come back to our panel. Yes, please, Ben.
I tried to resist the temptation to say more, but I feel compelled. It seems the rule in these national reforms is if you try to address the needs of creators only, you might lose out, you might find a lot of opposition from certain quarters. If you try to do reforms that address very strenuously the needs and the rights of the education sector and exceptions, you'll face a backlash. If you try to do both, you seem to also face opposition from many quarters. It's almost like if you win, you lose. If you lose, you lose. And we've got a few artists here, a few musicians who are going to join us at the reception later, for anybody who is able to make it, who have been fighting. In fact, they're veteran, well-known artists of the South African music scene who have been fighting for fair royalties. And in the South African reforms, and it's unfortunate we don't have a South African official here today, but in the South African reforms, they were very, very clear to include fair royalties alongside fair use. And even on doing that, there was still a bunch of interests somewhere in the middle that tried to convince everybody that this was the worst possible law, that somehow the fair royalties would bankrupt one part of the industry and fair use would bankrupt the other side of the industry. I just wondered on anyone's reflections on that, have you tried to do that sort of double-sided thing where everything is done comprehensively, you're addressing everybody's needs, and you try to convince, or, I mean, obviously you have to ignore some in industry who are going to say, you're standing on our turf, you're affecting our business models. But is that close to the Nigerian experience? Are there others who have tried to address everybody? Fair royalties, fair use, address the creators, address education and the exceptions all at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, I see your hand up there. Please go ahead.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you very much to the panelists for their interesting perspectives across countries. As someone who's been involved in South African copyright reform, we've used the Constitution a lot in terms of understanding how statutes must be interpreted within the constitutional frame. And in particular, when we consider copyright reform, we also consider Parliament's obligations to act in accordance with the Bill of Rights. And where Parliament seeks to limit the Bill of Rights through legislation, they must make sure that those limits are justifiable. And there's a test in the Constitution. So my question is for actually all the panelists across the board. Have you employed Bill of Rights arguments in your copyright reform processes? And just to sort of respond to the discussant from Cameroon, the argument here is not that we are introducing or trying to create something new. It's just sort of, we're working within a constitutional democracy. And so the Constitution and where constitutions have Bill of Rights, that sort of already exists. So really, it's just putting statutory copyright in its context and treating it like all other legislation. So I'm keen to hear from the panelists your experience in using the Constitution for copyright reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Thank you to the panelists. As I listened to all the conversations going on, I remember the work that we've done with some of my colleagues, Jeremy, Chidi, where we see entire sectors in Africa existing and thriving without due recourse to IP in general or any form of legal protection or regulations. So when you think about informal sectors, the innovations in the informal sectors, which are huge parts of Africa's economies. So as regulators, as scholars, how do you bring IP, copyright, for that matter, to bear on these sectors? TK is probably a good example of those areas that have not been touched previously by IP, but are very important to Africa. So as we grapple with the questions of copyright, are we not looking at very small parts of formal systems, formal institutions, and formal sectors at the expense of other areas within African societies or economies? Thank you.
Thank you. I see. Alan, you'd like to?
Thank you so much.
If I can just remind everyone, if you can quickly introduce yourself if you haven't spoken before, just so everyone.
Thank you so much, the panelists that we've had. We appreciate your expertise in, getting us on board on some of these issues in your national legislations. As you're all aware, and we had all indicated, ensuring a balanced IP system is very important for most of our economies in Africa. Try there's a balance between the right holders and the users. I was wondering to what extent limitation and exceptions as envisaged in our international legal instrument, in WIPO. At what extent are these L&Es shaping our national legislations and copyright systems? Thank you.
Okay, so I think for the benefit of our panel, to make sure you've got those, there were many questions already. We're going to respond that first and then see if we have time. We'll check for more questions. So I'd like first to give the floor to Elizabeth Nyagura, and then we can, I'm sorry, yes, to Sharon Chahale from Kenya, and then we can just go around each one and you can address the questions as you'd like. Sharon, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the new name, Elizabeth, but I'll stick with Sharon. I hope I got all your questions right. So let me start from bottom up. The Kenyans know what I'm talking about, the bottom up approach, yeah? So bottom up means that I'm starting from the last person. He was talking about the issues of exceptions and limitations. For us, we have tried to domesticate a lot of the treaties that we have ratified. So already Marrakesh is domesticated in our law. We have exceptions for libraries and archives also, for educational institutions also, and other general exceptions and limitations. Of course, with their own parameters to make sure that you're sort of balancing the interest of the user and the rights holder. I'm not sure, Dick, I got your question right. I didn't get it so well, but probably as others answer, we can review that. The lady who asked about the issue of the Constitution, for us, we had an amendment of our Constitution in 2010, and for the first time, our Constitution specifically addressed the issue of IP, that it should be respected. And so there are several articles which, I'm sorry, I can't remember right now offhand, that address IP. So for us, it's very easy to use the Constitution because it specifically addresses IP, culture, and things like that. We have had several matters as the Kenya Copyright Board before the Constitutional Court. One example is the CMO had taken us to court saying that our regulation is unconstitutional because of certain issues, and we have had judgments given on that issue that have formed precedent for us. So I think I agree with you that the Constitution and of course the Bill of Rights is also very useful in addressing copyright issues. I don't remember his name, but I just remember he's an activist. So I have, Ben, yeah. So I have to be careful, Ben, before you issue a placard against me right now. You're talking about the issue of balancing interests. I think probably the musicians here, if they were Kenyan, they'd be very happy to know that we recently, in one of our many amendments, had an amendment on actual percentages for royalties for ringback tones for musicians, because it had been an issue. I think they were getting such a really tiny percentage, and we have actually put in the law the percentage. I think it's 56% or something like that, and they were getting something like less than 10 before. Yeah, so of course the companies that do this and everyone else, there's so much interest here. But I think, especially with the regime that we have now, they have a focus on improving the lives of the artists. And basically, what they call, in Kiswahili, they put it as money in the pocket of the artist. So I think we are really trying to do that. You balance the interest of the rights holder, you balance the companies involved, you balance whoever, everybody else. It's always a tough thing to do. You will have backlash, definitely. Some of them end up in court. Yeah, but thankfully we have a legal team that's always ready to go to court and happy to go to court. The question on the advisories we issue, Professor, they're not like legal decisions, they're just advisories. And how they have come about, as I said, is because of a need that has arisen. Yeah. So, for example, during the pandemic, there was a lot of playing of music by DJs and whatever. Then there was a debate online on the issue of DJs and music and the use and infringement. And so we issued an advisory, and the advisory basically we issue would be that this is the position of the law. So as you do 1, 2, 3, kindly know that this is the position of the law. So it's not really like a law, and well, so far we have not had anybody take us to court with the advisories yet. So I'm yet to know what the judge would say, considering the advisory. Another example was that last year during our campaign period, there was a political party that used a song like in synchronization, yeah, during the campaigns. And so the first person who complained was the artist that this political party have used our song. And you see, this was a huge political party with a huge following, who at that point people thought, oh, probably this person could end up being the president. So you can see the interest that was really in this whole issue, yeah? And so we also issued an advisory just to say, in terms of copyright and synchronization, this is the position. So basically, our advisories are not like the law, you know. You're just telling somebody that if you probably eat excess, you're going to have a tummy ache, you know. You're not really, the advisories are not meant to be like the law. First, they are responding to whatever is happening and then just giving the position of the law as per our law, how it is, and just advising people. We also issued an advisory on memes last year again, which was also around the campaign period, and people are issuing memes and all that. So we also issue an advisory on that. We have issued an advisory on cover songs because we realized that a lot of people think that once you sing a song and say, put there, by the way, this is a cover song, that's enough, you know? And most people don't know where infringement occurs when it comes to cover song. Do we need permissions? Do we not? So we would just issue an advisory and say, with regards to this, this is the position of the law, so be careful. So it's not really an advisory of, I am the copyright board, I'm the big man, and I'm saying 1, 2, 3. No, it's just that you're giving information, basically, around a subject that has sparked interest at that point. Yeah, thank you.
So from Sharon, we move to Elizabeth. Please, Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you. I think the first question that was asked was to do with what extent the current exceptions being used is the demand at national level. What I want to say is that the current exceptions that we have in the current legislations, they are being used, but they are not used 100%. So that is why we are carrying out awareness, so that it's like the public are made aware of these exceptions and limitations, because otherwise others might not be fully using them, maybe being afraid that they will be infringing the copyrighted work. So there is need to actually conscientize them. And again, as a nation, we've adopted Education 5.0, whereby we are encouraging research and innovation. So there is now an increase in research, and when there is an increase in research, we also have to make sure that they know the limits and also what is not limited. Hence, we need to actually make them aware of the exceptions that are currently there. And then the demand for the new exceptions that we are proposing in the new bill, the demand is actually coming from the people, coming from the nation as a whole, and especially on the provision of exceptions for the visually impaired as well as the print disabled. Safe to say that we actually have even people living with the visually impaired who are part of the judiciary actually being so happy about these new provisions that we are proposing in the new bill, because they are going to benefit. So we are not only maybe being forced to have these exceptions because of maybe international maybe agendas. No, this is coming from the nation. This is coming from the domestic, for the domestic country. And then also the other, I think, question was to do with, which was from Ben, to do with balance between fair use as well as the rights of the holders. I want to say that the provisions that we are actually coming up with in the proposed bill, they are addressing both the interests of the right holders, in that what I only explained in my presentation were exceptions for the right users. I did not elaborate on the other provisions that are going to benefit the right holders, like reprography levy, which is now a new provision in the proposed bill. We also have a right of resale, another new provision in the proposed bill. We have another one on the review of offenses. We have reviewed offenses, again, for anyone who is going to infringe the rights of the right holders. So we are balancing both the interest of the right holders as well as the right users. And the other one was on whether we are also using the constitution when we come up with these reforms. I want to say that Zimbabwe's constitution is a very new constitution that came into effect in 2013 and actually recognizes property rights. So that means we actually made sure that we are also in compliance with the constitution when we come up with these reforms in the new bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I'd like to hand over to John.
Thank you very much. Quickly on the speed bumps, well, like every speed bump, some you slowly climb, some you just avoid, and if you're unlucky and you don't see the speed bump early enough, then you have a real, bumpy ride. There's some areas that are not within the control of the person who is pushing for the reform. Some are more of the general national problems, so it depends on what kind of speed bump we're looking at. For instance, the lack of political will, you may just have to find ways of giving the process your own traction, rather than waiting for some politician to become a major driver. When it comes to the lack of resources, then you have to look for alternative or cheaper ways of getting things done. And then, but I think it's important when we look at the issue of well, for competing national interests, you just have to pray on that one. I wouldn't have a solution. But there are cases where you will need to carry stakeholders along. It does help. And you may need some of them to become, to be the voices that will counter the opposition in some areas. For instance, when the Nigerian process was going on, I would say that one of the provisions we brought in public interest that had very minimal opposition was the implementation of the Marrakesh Treaty. And good enough, we had the Nigerian Association of the Blind that was very much on top of the issues, and they knew what they wanted. In fact, they made some very good interventions that made us to have to change the wordings, the text of the provision, even away from what Marrakesh had, led us to believe was the right language. I think it had to do with the issue of whether it was for commercial use rather than, just that it was not for profit, and we saw reason with them. So it's good to take on as many stakeholder groups as possible, because they are the ones that will help to find solutions to some of these speed bumps, and where there is no inertia or there is low energy from the political class, then you may need them to just give the push for everyone to know that this is something that should be supported. You may not be able to win all. There are areas where you just lose control, or you don't have control, and you re-strategize for that. For instance, In the case of Nigeria, I didn't mention this. I should have mentioned it when I was making my first presentation. It turned out that of the 109 sections that we have in the present bill, only one had a red flag. And that was one red flag that we couldn't just overlook, but at the same time we couldn't easily concede on. And it had to do, incidentally, with the issue of having an exception for public interest, where you can grant a compulsory license in overriding public interest, or where there's an abuse of a dominant position. And I think some entrepreneurs and some strong interest didn't want that, you know. And the argument was that if you did that, you discourage direct foreign investment, you will kill the industry, you will not encourage local creators. It just didn't fly. I mean, I just didn't see the logic in the arguments. And so I would say, okay, so we will have to pander to all that and then allow for abuse of dominant position, or we will forego overriding public interest. And for us, I mean, there just wasn't any, convincing argument against that section, and we're not willing to trade off that section. So it still remains in the bill, and we'll see how things play out. So that also brings us to the issue of how we balance all the interests. There will be very strong entrenched interests, and for some of them, they're not really negotiating for you to come to some balance. It's either you take it or they want you to leave it. So if you're able to call the bluff, then you leave it and see what happens. So for instance, we had to be careful with not moving away from fair dealing into fair use, because I mean, we have a long tradition of fair dealing. What we did was to more or less rework the fair dealing provision in such a way that it will be more flexible, and then it will also have some guidance for the courts and whoever would want to use it. And we think that that has helped to come to some compromise, move away from the classical English fair dealing provision, but not get into the American fair use provision. So we were able to cross that bump without much injury. So on using the Constitution, in the case of Nigeria, I would say fortunately, we don't have the provision on IP in our Constitution. I say fortunately because I think we can manage without locking ourselves into some constitutional immutable provisions. But countries that have it are using it well, but for us we don't have it. So arguments have never reached that level where we have to call on the Constitution. But I think it's because most people know that there are some rights that you don't even need to argue over. And so those rights remain, overriding as far as the issues are concerned. Well, I don't know what the question about how we bring IP to bear on traditional and culture-based products. Well, a good example where I see that one has to be careful in trying to achieve this is the provision on expressions of folklore, which I say, if many countries copied it from Nigeria, and they've just ended up joining, the group of countries that are not using it, and that has been the case in many African countries. But we have begun to use it now because we've had requests, and we are beginning to see how to navigate without necessarily putting a lock on the folklore. You can provide some safe way of protocols for people to use expressions of folklore. But in the long run, we draw from the arguments and the positions at the international level, and these often help in designing the intervention strategies at national level. And that also dovetails into the question about the discussions at the SCCR and the national level reforms. although we are not making all the progress we want to make, like Professor Chidi mentioned, the discussions are often very helpful in illuminating and helping us to understand the dimensions and the various issues at the national level, and then you can then pick and choose the solutions that you think will be helpful as a first aid while you wait for the international instruments to mature. You already have some solutions that will help you to grow and move the issues at the national level. I think those are the areas I think I need to react to.
Thank you so much. So now to Professor Chidi, you might, if you want to reflect on any of those questions, but so far one response perhaps I haven't heard so much on the question was with regards to, in some respect, are we being too IP-centric sometimes in our solutions, and should there be more holistic, or are we addressing necessarily for some issues such as traditional knowledge in the correct manner?
Thank you. Dick mentioned my name, so I have to speak up. Otherwise, I'll disappoint him. Before I do, the reference to the Constitution is very important. I'll give you an example. Recently, Canada adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as an act of parliament in 2021. Now, this is very important. I'm doing a project presently where you look at our section 35 of the Constitutional Act of 1982, which says that existing Aboriginal rights are hereby preserved and affirmed. And then you look for a country that has adopted wholesale all the 46 sections of the declaration as an act of parliament, then I find a very technical way of entrenching intellectual property and traditional knowledge pursuant to Article 31 of the Declaration. So the constitutional model is really very helpful, particularly in specific national contexts, such as I have described. I find it vitally useful for advancing, in my own case, as you could see, indigenous rights in the context of intellectual property. Now, to the question posed by Dick, I see two things happening in relation to intellectual property and the informal sector. That was the phrase you used. We are not, the informal sector has a dilemma. They are being choked by intellectual property. They are being co-opted or pressured to become part of the system. But there is also something we can learn. This inquiry of interfacing intellectual property with the informal sector. Jeremy and I have just graduated a doctoral student whose thesis was actually in a part probing on the Igbo apprenticeship system as an intellectual property system, sort of, where you have somebody, you introduce them into your trade, you train them for a specific number of years, they know the secret of your trade. You can even have trade restriction agreement with them. You cannot set up here when I settled you so close, or sometimes they can allow you to do that. And of course, every trade has its own secrets. And this is a very unique intellectual property system. The problem we have as non-Westerners or as Africans is when we hear a phrase in the Eurocentric sense, we just put it in our mental state. We have other ways of protecting knowledge for purposes that may not necessarily be for hoarding it and optimizing profit for one person. I'll give you the second example. The Nollywood industry in Nigeria. I've written so much about this, but look at how they manage intellectual property. The example of how Nigerian movie industry has imploded is such that if we had stuck strictly to intellectual property optimum maximization, we would have had about 1 or 2 mega Nollywood kind of studios. That's all you would have had, cashing in on all these artists and super talented individuals and giving them handouts. But because they were a little democratic in their intellectual property mechanisms, even though they didn't do it deliberately, and I'm not going to unpack it here, what you have is a democratization of wealth through a combination of the informal sector and some splicing of intellectual property, so that the wealth goes into every home. But if we were to use the American model of the Nollywood, Hollywood's practice, you have about 1, 2, 3 big studios, and the rest of the people are slaving for them. So that is really a very creative way of not throwing away intellectual property, but using it in a way that will preserve the informal sector, which is the heart of the African economy.
Thank you, Chidi. George, would you like to add your reflections?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't think a specific question was addressed to me, but nevertheless, I would like to say that I appreciated the various interventions. I think this is the kind of expertise African diplomats need at WIPO during negotiations on exceptions and limitations. When defending our positions, we need to take concrete examples to highlight what we are asking for. And I remember a discussion I had some years back with a WIPO Deputy Director General during a meeting held somewhere in Africa. She told me that you guys, you are asking for additional exceptions and limitations. Why are you not implementing existing limitations and exceptions? Why are you asking for more exceptions and limitations? So I was very, very annoyed because, I'm not an expert on these issues. So the discussions we are having here, to me, can be very, very useful when we are defending our positions, our proposals within the WIPO SCCR. I thank you.
Okay, so I think we've come now to the end of this session. So if you can join me in giving oh, yes, please go ahead. We do have the time for an additional question. Please go ahead or comments.
Thank you. My name is Kathy Matsika. I'm from Zimbabwe. And I sort of would like to comment and maybe thank the Deputy Director from Zimbabwe for presenting such good news, which I've heard at this conference, and I'm very pleased about it, because I have been involved in academic institutions as a university librarian. And one of the things that we were worried about, that we've always debated and gotten worried about, was the way the Copyright Act that is being repealed never really represented the requirements that we needed to support our work as academic librarians. One of the things that was a real challenge was this term fair dealing, and I'm happy Dr. John Asein from Nigeria is addressed it and partially answered my worry, because I think it needs unpacking. And this is the reason why the other commenter said, why add to the things that are not being used in Zimbabwe? It's because people don't understand fair dealing. And now that the office is now going to be addressing and trying to explain, and hopefully they will list or make a simpler explanation of what fair dealing is for the users to understand what this copyright legislation is all about. It might help. It will actually make users in Zimbabwe, both holders as well as users, understand exactly what it means to have fair dealing in our act. And we also, as university librarians, we're always worried about the balance that has been discussed by all the presenters. Balance, did the act represent or cover all the groups that had an interest in copyright? We always thought the act favored collectors, because if you looked at the old bill or old act that was there was only a very small section that referred to fair dealing, which I think is supposed to be the one covering all the exceptions that the libraries could actually use. Yet there were about 3 pages of sections that dealt with the collectors, collecting societies. And as a result, collecting societies used to bully universities, wanting this, trying to drive this, and representing the real interests of publishers and in the industry. So now, if you are going to be going to educate the community, I sure hope that even the Act will now bring out exactly what covers the users, what covers the collecting societies, what covers everybody else who has got an interest, and hence the balance would be very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that comment. So we'll be closing the session now, but prior to that, I'd just like to give 1 minute back to our panelists, starting by our discussant. As the theme for our session was on copyright identification of public interest, and we looked at international efforts and domestic reforms, if you could just summarize each one, what would you consider for the future now priorities, either in the international agenda or in the national agenda for future reform? What would you highlight as priorities that we need to focus on? And if I can start with Professor Joseph Fometeu, please. Do we still have the microphone for Professor Fometeu? No. Oh, there it is. You're okay? You will know. Okay. Can I please ask Jace if you would like to highlight for us any priority area for reform you think is important? You're good. Okay, thank you. Would any of the panelists like to take that up? Professor Chidi?
Okay.
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 So, from African perspective, actually, we cannot be tired of talking about TK. TK has been introduced in the altar of intellectual property, kicking and dragging itself, or being dragged unwillingly. And the sincerity of placing TK in that place is suspect. And therefore, as a continent and as a people whose epistemic orientation is radically different from the Western one, we have an opportunity to keep talking about TK. There is a lot of education that needs to happen. And the whole idea of trying to pigeonhole TK into intellectual property, try as we may have over the years to say that it's a non-fit, it's a square peg on a round hole, that doesn't seem to resonate sufficiently in several fora. If you look at all the WIPO committee processes, you still see a segment of major stakeholders who would rather refashion TK in the image of conventional intellectual property. So speaking as an African, I think it's a very major battle, and it should be probably something at the center stage in intellectual property policy making at international level. Thank you.
Well, not much, except to say that at the national level, it's important that we are able to demonstrate commitment to these provisions by doing everything we can, not just to have them in our laws, but also helping the users to use the exceptions. For instance, I know that in many countries in Nigeria you have fair dealing, and you would expect that it would be a defense that will be coming up in every other case, but I'm not sure we've had more than maybe 2 or 3 cases where fair dealing has ever been brought up as a defense. So it means that those who should be in the forefront of using that provision haven't been using it over the years. So we need to do more in that regard by way of public education and sensitization. Now, at the international level, frankly, I think we should continue the way we are going and strengthen the position of the African group, knowing that it doesn't matter how strong your arguments are, those that wouldn't want to yield, they will have a statement that they will read at every session. So even before the session starts, they've written the statement they're going to read. But we should all know that this is how it goes with international negotiations, and hopefully if we keep hitting, we'll be able to crack that point and move forward. I'm not a fan of adding too many issues at this point. Let's see how we go with the ones we've been pushing for. Thank you.
I think our priority is now on the implementation. Like I've said, that I think what we have now is satisfactory, but now we have now to prioritize on the implementation, and also emphasize that we have got 2 bills that are running concurrently, and this will also affect both the reforms as well as how the office is going to be restructured. So that is where our priority is now, based on what is going on in the office. Thank you.
Great, so thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Viviana. My final word will be to highlight the fact that the African group has tabled, a work program on exceptions and limitations before the SCCR, and we are looking forward, to the implementation of the said work program. During the implementation of the work program that has been submitted by the African group, we will need the contribution of the African experts dealing with SCCI issues, concrete contribution. So it is a call for experts, African experts, present in the room or not present in the room, to continue to support the African group of negotiators. And I'm also calling on member states, if possible, to sponsor the participation of African experts at WIPO meetings. As you all know, until now, most of the African experts taking part in WIPO meetings are funded by WIPO. And WIPO is funding only a limited number of participants. 5 per session. That's very, very few. And if you are funded by WIPO, it is difficult to come and oppose to WIPO at the same time. So I believe it is time for us not only to rely on WIPO funding to take part in international negotiations taking place in the WIPO premises. We have to think about our own self-funding to be in a position to be proud and to really defend Africa interests within the WIPO. So I call on the support of experts to provide us with technical papers, with analysis, with position papers, with documents, with studies, to support our positions, our proposals, and then I also call on member states to provide experts with funding so that they can take part in WIPO meetings. I thank you.
Thank you, George, for those important points. And for anyone who's interested in following those meetings, they are available by webcast, always virtually. So you can, even if you cannot attend Geneva, you can always follow online. And so that's important to note, that there is that clear way of learning what's happening and then finding the right way to provide those inputs directly. So thank you, everyone who was on the panel and to our discussants. We can have a round of applause, please. Thank you.